Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be shedding light on the dangers and health effects pertaining to succumbing to experiencing chronic stress. What are they, you may ask? Without further ado, without further delay, allow me to demystify that answer to that inquiry right here, right now. First and foremost, lamentably, much to my dismay, much to my consternation, much to my chagrin, much to my grief, much to my agony, and much to my distress, experiencing chronic stress can indeed be ineffably perilous. It can indeed be eminently dangerous, to say the least. How so, you may ask? Well, it not only significantly reduces your quality of life and puts a damper on your mood, but it renders you all the more prone to succumb into chronic burnout and chronic fatigue, and of course, an increased mortality rate. Nothing salubrious, nothing beneficent can ensue from succumbing to chronic stress. It exacerbates every facet of your life, and it renders life all the more arduous to live in every facet, especially when you are being incessantly besieged by acute chronic stressors. You do not want your chronic stress to remain unmitigated. You do not want your chronic stress to remain unalleviated. You should do everything in your purview. You should do everything under your jurisdiction to alleviate chronic stress. So, what are the adverse health effects pertaining to succumbing to experiencing chronic stress? Well, when you are chronically stressed out, it impinges on your immune system health. It undermines your immune system health. It renders you all the more prone to contracting a bacterial infection, a viral infection, and of course, a fungal infection. It can also render you all the more prone to succumb to depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, sleep problems, and of course an increased likelihood of succumbing to a heart attack or stroke. As I stated earlier, experiencing chronic stress can indeed severely compromise your sacrosanct, invaluable, precious immune system health. When you experience chronic stress, you're the more apt to experience both chronic burnout and chronic fatigue. When you experience chronic stress, you have a significantly reduced quality of life. When experiencing chronic stress results in experiencing chronic fatigue, your lack of sleep renders you all the more apt to develop Alzheimer's disease, be in a low state of energy, and even renders you at a greater risk of succumbing to a heart attack or stroke. Now, why are people who experience chronic stress susceptible to experiencing chronic fatigue and chronic burnout? Well, in an attempt to mitigate chronic stress, they may work more hours. They may forgo sleeping, especially if they deem that to be a temporary remedy to partially rectify their financial situation that is inducing chronic stress. However, that's not a viable, prudent, salubrious remedy. That's not the panacea to alleviating chronic stress. You shouldn't succumb to improving your finances at the cost of your sleep and at the cost of your well-being. It's better to be stressed out than it is to be less stressed out and chronically fatigued and chronically burned out. So, when you succumb to burnout, it's much more arduous to cope with being besieged by chronic stressors, and it's much more arduous to efficaciously handle day-to-day responsibilities. It can be debilitating, it can be agonizing, it can be distressful to experience chronic burnout. Incessantly working, unremittingly working, ceaselessly working is not the solution for alleviating chronic stress. Just because you work more hours and generate more revenue does not mean that your financial issues will be remedied. If you want to remedy your financial issues, focus on building your recurring revenue stream so that they can offset your recurring expenses. You never want your earnings potential to be tethered to your sacrosanct, indispensable, finite, precious, non-replenishable time. So, to recapitulate, to recap, in sum, succinctly stated, the dangers of succumbing to experiencing chronic stress encompass being all the more prone to experience chronic burnout and chronic fatigue in an attempt to alleviate chronic stress, as well as being all the more prone to having a reduced quality of life. Furthermore, when you experience chronic stress, you're all the more poised to succumb to an increased mortality rate and a decreased longevity rate. It is quite lamentable, it is quite tragic, it is quite unfortunate, but it is what it is. As per the health effects of succumbing to experiencing chronic stress, it results in having compromised immune system health, which renders you all the more susceptible to experiencing the perils of contracting a bacterial infection, viral infection, and of course a fungal infection. You're also at an increased risk to develop stroke, and even succumb to a heart attack. Nothing salubrious, nothing beneficent can ensue from having cortisol pervade your vessel. When you succumb to experiencing chronic stress that remains unmitigated, you're the more apt to succumb to chronic burnout and chronic fatigue, and be all the less capable of competently functioning and completing day-to-day tasks. Because when you are frazzled, fatigued, vitiated, torpid, and impaired due to a lack of sleep, you cannot function optimally. And when you are chronically burnt out, it's much more arduous, it is much more cumbersome to perform daily tasks and carry out responsibilities. You're at an increased risk for contracting a perilous, lethal, hazardous, life-altering chronic disease when you succumb to experiencing chronic stress. If you are chronically fatigued, due to being chronically stressed out, then you are all the more susceptible to developing Alzheimer's disease. People presume that working more hours, foregoing sleep, will be the remedy, will be the elixir, will be the panacea to allowing them to alleviate their chronic stress. But just because they may improve their financial situation by a negligible degree as a result of working more hours does not mean that their chronic stress will be alleviated. When you sell your sacrosanct, indispensable, finite, precious, and valuable time for a pittance of fiat currency, it does not provide you with a perpetual revenue stream. It's just ephemeral, fleeting, perishable short-term relief. As I stated earlier, if you want to pull yourself out of the muck and mire and get out of poverty, you need your recurring revenue streams as an aggregate to be lofty enough, to be high enough to offset your recurring expenses. So if you relinquish more hours to an employer, that's not going to be conducive to growing your recurring revenue streams. It's just going to provide you with more fleeting, ephemeral, perishable, short-term relief. And it will exacerbate your life when you succumb to chronic burnout and chronic fatigue in an attempt to remedy your financial situation that is inducing chronic stress. An employer will never pay you a livable wage, let alone a subsistence wage. They want to always pay you the absolute minimum amount for the absolute maximum amount of time worked. Lamentably, they view their employees as expendable, exploitable, harvestable capital livestock to be harvested for profiteering purposes. Their overarching goal is to maximize the wealth of their shareholders and maximize their profits. That's not conducive to maximizing your well-being. So, attempt to be profoundly successful as an entrepreneur. Do everything in your purview to pull yourself out of the muck and mire and move your life in a forward movement trajectory. You do not need to stagnate. You do not need to regress. You do not need to be impeded, nor obstructed, nor encumbered, nor stymied, nor stifled. There are ways in which you can build your wealth that do not revolve around being an indentured servant to an employer. You do not need to work a debilitating, agonizing, brutally wretched, dead-end, minimum wage, dispiriting, unfulfilling, harrowing job for a pittance of short-term relief. There are other ways to generate revenue. You can work in the capacities of an entrepreneur or as a freelancer or even as a gig economy worker. However, you do not want your earnings potential to be tethered to your time. You want your earnings potential to be boundless, unfettered, and limitless. And not capped by a measly, infinitesimal, non-subsistence wage imposed by an employer who does not give an iota about your well-being. When you are an indentured servant to an employer, you're borrowing equity out of your time, life, health, happiness, dignity, and future wealth just for a pittance of a non-subsistence wage. It does not provide you with an iota of recurring revenue. So, embrace pursuing entrepreneurial pursuits. Embrace cultivating behemoth brands across a myriad of social media platforms, and embrace creating a robust portfolio of income generating assets. You could leverage your Behemoth's brands on social media channels as potent marketing vehicles to vector your target market to your product pages where they have the autonomy to procure your product offerings from. You want your income generating assets as an aggregate to generate enough revenue to offset your recurring expenses. I cannot punctuate that enough. Once again, I hope that you deem this video to be insightful, enthralling, engrossing, and of course, informative. Have a blissful day. Goodbye.